Okay, good morning everybody. We're on to our final topic in macroeconomics, which is supply side policies. Up until now, we've been looking at demand side policies as methods by which aggregate demand can be manipulated by government, by the central bank, in order to bring us back to the long run equilibrium, okay, or what we refer to as potential output. In this particular lesson, we're going to be looking at a different approach to economic growth, one that looks into the long run rather than the short run. And these set of policies are referred to as supply side policies. And it should not surprise you to know that they deal with the issue of aggregate supply and increasing the amount of aggregate supply in the economy. In other words, what they essentially do is they create more aggregate supply and therefore they create more long-term real GDP output. Okay, so in this lesson, what we're going to be considering is what are supply side policies, and we're going to be looking at the historical context in which supply side policies were born in the 1980s, particularly in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America. Quick little guessing game here. Which of these four politicians do you think were major proponents of supply side policies? Which of these politicians do you think supported the expansion of supply side policy? And that's your time up. And you probably have worked out that it was the two politicians, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, that were governing their countries in the 1980s. Supply side policies are usually associated with these two politicians. Margaret Thatcher, the United Kingdom Prime Minister from 1979 to 1991, and Ronald Reagan, the United States of America President between 1980 and 1988. So, we're going to be looking at a little bit of the history of supply side policies. Supply side policies, in many respects, were a counter to the Keynesian fiscal policy consensus of the period between 1945 and the 1970s, and you'll need to know a little bit about the context in which supply side policies thrived during the 1980s and how they were a reaction against Keynesian economics. You'll also learn that there are, in effect, two sets of supply side policies. There are what we call government interventionist supply side policies, and there are what we call market-based supply side policies, and sometimes these are referred to as the nasty supply side policies. Okay, and we'll look at those in separate dealings in this week's learning. Let's just remind ourselves of what we're actually talking about here. The idea that in the long run aggregate supply, you can increase the total sum of real GDP without any impact on the price level, i.e. inflation, whatsoever. And in this example, you see an economy has managed to increase the output of real GDP through maybe an increase in land, labour, capital, enterprise. And as you see, the resulting increase in aggregate demand has resulted in no inflation. There is no increase in the price level. The price level will stay the same. Why has that occurred? Because the increase in aggregate supply. The long run aggregate supply increased. That was met with increased demand, and that's resulted in increased real GDP, but no inflation. So unlike demand side policies, they do not create inflation. Okay, so in this week's learning, now that I've given you a brief introduction to supply side policies, we're going to be thinking in greater detail about them. Now, one of the things that you can be aware of from the beginning is what we call the Solow model of economic growth, which puts a huge stress that economic growth is based upon improvement in three fundamentals. And those are A, ideas, E and L, which is education and labour, and K, which is capital, i.e. an improvement in any of these things, ideas, education, labour, and capital, will result in an improvement in long-run aggregate supply and therefore economic growth. Please watch the video on the Solow model named after the Nobel Prize winning economist Robert Solow. As a quick reminder, what we mean by short-run aggregate supply, and much of what demand-side policy is seeking to do essentially by shifting the AD curve is to manipulate the short-run aggregate supply in the economy. So it's very important that you can distinguish between what we mean by short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. If you need a quick recap on what the short-run aggregate supply curve is, then you should watch this video. What we're really interested in today, of course, and this week, is long-run aggregate supply. And this video must be watched because it really does explain the importance of long-run aggregate supply. So what are the things that can be done to increase long-run aggregate supply in the economy? The sorts of things that we can do to increase long-run aggregate supply in the economy are called supply-side policies. And I suggest that you watch this video. It's very much related to the United Kingdom context, and it will give you some examples of what are referred to as supply-side policies. And this video will be useful watching for our activity 2, which is to start to collect examples of what we refer to as market-based supply-side policies and interventionist supply-side policies. Market-based supply-side policies can roughly be summarized as any policies that have the intention of allowing market forces to be freer and enable an increase in long-run supply, for example, of land, labour, capital or enterprise. And interventionist supply-side policies are any policies which are imposed by government which would have the same impact of increasing land, labour, capital, enterprise. And what I'd like you to do is using either Cognity or utilising, Cognity is very good by the way for this topic, or using the Cambridge or the Oxford textbooks, the supply side chapters in both those textbooks. I want you to come up with a list of the types of market supply side policies and a list of the interventionist supply side policies, and then you are going to find me real world examples of both. You can also then, in this final column, talk about how effective these were in actually seeing an increase in the overall growth rate of the economy. Now, for this final column, Cognity is where you're going to look. It's important that you're looking Cognity at the supply side chapter. To kickstart your research for the examples, I provided some articles below which may be helpful. There are 6 in total. Have a look at those. And there's some key ideas here that will help you along. So if you need to Google or you need to do some research, these would be some good keywords to put into your search engine. So if you're looking at, for example, how Reagan influenced supply-side policies, utilize these key terms. And if you're looking at maybe how Thatcher utilized supply-side policies, then you're looking at maybe these terms. Okay, the final activity is to look at Australia and to look at this article from The Economist and decide what Australia should do. Okay, I'd like you to take use of CLASP, make use of CLASP, which is conclusions, long-term, short-term, assumptions, stakeholders, pros and cons, and priorities. And I'd like you to think about whether Australia should utilize supply-side policies given its current economic condition, which you'll find out in the Economist article. Okay, the limits to growth. I will also put a link down the bottom here so that you can actually download that article direct, so you don't need to go on the Economist website. So this week, basically what you are going to do is you're going to start reading through about the history of supply side policies. You need to watch these videos and then this particular lecture, and you're going to then complete a task taking notes on the different forms of supply-side policies, market-based supply-side policies, and then interventionist supply-side policies, and then do an activity based on Australia and whether Australia should implement supply-side policies or not, given its current economic condition. So that is this week's learning. I will summarize that as well in written form, and we will see you, of course, on the Zoom call tomorrow at 9:45. I hope you have a great day, and see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.